purpose of DMORT is to go in and assist a local community when they are strapped beyond their means to take care of a mass death situation. When you first get there, you're overwhelmed. You know, I used to just shudder. How can we ever resolve the issues that are here? The dead that are out there need to be recovered in order to put the community back to life.
Wow, the sight of a disaster hits you through all of your senses at one time. It's the sight, the smell, the sound, and sometimes the lack of sound that really makes the impact.
Your first response is denial and just this total shock. Sometimes there's a desire to just flee, run, hide, all of these emotions. It's just hysteria. It's just so sudden, it's so traumatic.
It's like a war zone. I mean, it's happening so fast and it permeates, it's just all around you and you're in the middle of it. There's no escape from it.
A disaster strikes, and legions of workers arrive to rescue the survivors. But who is there to recover the dead and comfort their grieving families? Gail Dunham lost her husband in an airline crash. No one was there to support her, and she was devastated.
Oh, Hal was only 52 years old. He was a wonderful captain. Gretchen was only 17, our daughter, when her father was killed on the job. When you lose a loved one in a disaster, it's that day that you never have to put on the calendar. You will always remember that day. Sunday morning, 9:43, March 3rd, the United 585 crashed and 25 wonderful people were gone. We were not notified until 4 o'clock on Monday afternoon. We wanted to visit the crash site. That was denied. We were told that family members were forbidden from visiting the crash site. There was very little effort to return personal effects. We had this need to know. We really needed to know, was Hal truly the pilot on that plane? And even if someone tells you, you don't accept that. You're still in denial. You want to think that someone has made a mistake and that your loved one is still alive.
The needs that the family will have will be, first of all, for information. You know, if it were happening with me and for my family, I'd want to know. I want to know what has happened. Where is this person that's a part of my family that I love?
Disaster victims leave behind loved ones filled with an aching sense of loss and disbelief. Those families desperately need the truth, delivered with compassion. In 1990, a group of volunteers, led by Tom Shepherdson, set out to fill that need.
It began basically with the Avianca air crash on Long Island. We had in New York State formulated a group of funeral directors and coroners and medical examiners with a response team to help out other coroners or medical examiners in our state. And when the Avianca air crash came in, all of the families went to the medical examiner's office to get information.
The medical examiner asked Shepherdson to find a place where the families of victims could meet.
So in the middle of the night, we went off to a Marriott hotel and commandeered the ballroom and got our papers translated into Spanish. But we also incorporated other agencies to be involved with that. The police department, fire service, security service. We also needed food. We needed mental health people. All of this came together overnight because we had to begin operations the next morning. And we basically formulated a team out of that.
Just 2 months later, the Bronx erupted in fire and chaos.
The Happy Land Social Club in New York City was basically homicide. Disgruntled boyfriend threw gasoline into the one door of the Happy Land Social Club and then pulled down the steel door that was there. He threw it in the other door and then he lit it and pulled down the door. All these people were in the building. They had no way of getting out, so they died.
New York City asked Tom Shepherdson and his volunteers to gather the families and assist with the grim task of identifying the dead. Avianca and Happy Land proved that local communities were not prepared to handle mass fatalities. The United States had recently established the Federal Disaster Response Plan. It focused on survivors. Tom Shepardson and his team wanted a plan that also provided for the dead and their families. Officials asked Tom to gather experts to develop a mass fatality response course. This course began to train diverse teams of men and women from across the country, private citizens who would become paid federal workers during a disaster. In 1992, the Disaster Mortuary Response Team, DMORT, was born. DMORT members are required to drop their private lives and respond instantly to a disaster. Although they come from many walks of life, they are united by a solemn commitment to recover the dead and return them to their loved ones.
DMORT is a service organization. It's the last service we can do to take care of someone who has died. The faster we can have the bodies identified, confirm that identity, and then notify the family, the sooner the family will be able to continue their grieving process.
DMORT's first formal task was a new class of emergency, the recovery of victims who were dead before the disaster.
During the floods of '93, we had the levees breaking along the Missouri River and was flooding several towns in the Ray County area. When the governor of the state of Missouri flew over, they flew over low over the cemetery at Hardin, and they thought they saw a vault floating in the cemetery. And at that time, they dispatched me down to the cemetery, and we indeed did find a steel vault floating in the cemetery.
My father and I run a tow service in Richmond, Missouri, and we have crane equipment and flatbed trucks. We were called in to recover the vaults that had washed out. It's hard to describe, to make someone picture a scene that devastating. There was a hole drilled in the middle of a cemetery, approximately 70 feet deep. Of course, the hole's full of water, so really it looks like a big lake in the middle of a cemetery. And of course, caskets strewn over a 30-mile area.
The floods washed out 769 grave sites, some dating back to the late 1800s, and dispersed caskets over a 65,000-acre area. When the waters receded, bodies and caskets had drifted throughout the community, even into people's front yards. Summer heat created a serious health risk. It was essential to work quickly.
Well, of course, I was trying to fight off the job, because a coroner's job is to pronounce cause and manner of death, and these folks were already had cause and manner pronounced and buried. I took on the cemetery washout because really nobody else wanted to. In our area, we felt like we could handle at least 50 bodies if that type of disaster happened. When we approached the 50 mark, we went ahead and called in Tom Shepardson, who is the commander of the DMORT system.
DMORT brought in equipment and teams of specialists to help with the enormous task. Forensic experts set up a morgue and began to examine and x-ray the bodies.
We brought in forensic anthropologists, forensic dentists, forensic pathologists, and odontologists. We brought in funeral directors and embalmers to help with the recovery effort. We also brought in x-ray techs and x-ray equipment.
Most bodies and caskets over 100 years old could not be identified. They had turned to dust. The newer caskets could be traced by their serial numbers. DMORT members also documented clothing, jewelry, and any items found with the body. They asked relatives together at a local community center.
We met with them at least twice a day to give them updates on what we were doing, how we were doing it, and the problems we were having, and at the same time starting to gather antemortem data from them, information as far as names of victims, clothing, etc., and so on.
Dean Snow discovered that families were frantic for information.
You know, a family never expects to have to rebury a loved one. Once they bury them in a cemetery, why, they think that that body is safe and sacred ground, would never be disturbed again.
After 5 months of intense work, DMORT members helped the community of Hardin rebury the last casket. They had recovered 607 bodies and returned these ancestors to the community.
When we saw the way that the DMORT teams respect the dead and really care for them and their loved ones. It's something you can't help but want to be a part of.
After his work with the cemetery washout, Kevin Carmichael became a member of DMORT.
Actually, it was a beautiful, quiet spring morning here, and I had just walked out to the front desk, and just about the time I got there was just an enormous, deep boom, and the entire building shook. One of our pathologists went immediately to the back of the building to look toward the downtown area, and he came back and said it looked as if all downtown was on fire.
That morning would forever be remembered for the largest mass murder in the history of the nation, the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building.
I didn't believe it. I said, that can't possibly be. Who is going to blow up an office building filled with people and an office building that has a daycare nursery in it? Who would possibly do something like that? There has to be another explanation. The first call I got from the police said that you should be prepared to receive 1,000 fatalities. So I poured myself another cup of coffee because that's almost incomprehensible. And in reality, they weren't far off. We had 168 fatalities and over 700 people injured.
After getting information about how much damage was done and the number of people, my first thing was I was scared to death. It was fear, it really was.
Ray was a member of DMORT and had taught the mass fatalities course for several years, although he had prayed that he would never need to use it.
I knew what needed to be done, so we began putting our plan into operation immediately. And this was a 9-story building that was concrete and glass, a lot of metal, and the front 1/3 of the building went up into a Christmas tree design, and then it all fell down in a huge pile of rubble, and this huge pile of rubble was about 40 feet high all across the front of the building. This made extremely difficult recovery.
As hope faded for more survivors, the focus turned to the dead. Ray called on DMORT. He put together a team to survey the devastation and begin the dangerous recovery efforts.
There was a temporary morgue established at the site across the street from the building. We began evaluation of the bodies that had been recovered. Most of those were recovered by the police and fire and citizens that had gone to the scene immediately. Many of the first individuals coming out were children.
It is a controlled chaos. That's the best way to describe it. There's a tremendous energy that's being expended by people, and there's an intensity with everyone. You cannot work in this type of an environment without that sense of pressure and intensity that exists, because you're dealing with what were people. They're the bodies, the remains of people who died in these very horrific ways.
Now the team needed to begin the difficult task of identifying the dead. The bodies were taken from the temporary morgue to the medical examiner's office.
Once the bodies arrived here from the scene, we had stations set up. First of all, they would go to a pathology station. At this station, they would document all of the injuries, any missing limbs, anything that might be of value to help determine the cause of death and also help with the identification of that body. Then they would go to the second station. Full body photographs would be taken, as well as fingerprints would be taken. The third station was usually the radiology station, where full body x-rays was taken of each victim. At the dental station, a complete dental exam would be done if we needed to do a dental comparison. This office went from a staff of about 35 on the day of the bombing to about 300.
DMORT members worked side by side with the people of Oklahoma, caring for the bodies of strangers with compassion and dignity. They struggled to find meaning in an impossibly tragic situation.
Well, I think for myself as well as for the rest of the society, we came of age because someone had done this, and we always thought that we believed it would not happen. The sense of rage that's there for our people, we try to channel the energy of that anger into the work that we do.
It was so irrational an act, totally out of context with anything that I've ever seen before. Knowing within the rubble that there were bodies, knowing that there were children involved, I had to sit back and think about what had happened, attempt to rationalize it, and then begin the job.
The real reason for DMORT, the families. Ken Thompson recalls the Oklahoma City bombing.
I was about 5 miles from the bombing, sitting in my office, and all the windows in my office shook very heavily. At that point in time, I got up, looked out the drive-in of the credit union that I worked in, and saw a white puff of smoke from the downtown area, and then it immediately turned to black smoke. I knew that was close to my mother, so I looked on the television, and there was a helicopter news footage of the front of the building, and at that point, I felt as if my mom was gone. I went down to one of the local hospitals, St. Anthony's Hospital in Oklahoma City, and I went down there and spent about 6 hours trying to find my mom. Located one of her coworkers that actually walked out of the building, and he basically told me that she was on the other side of the hall and that the other side of the hall was gone. So about 6 o'clock that evening, my family, my brother and my sister and I, as well as my sister-in-law, started meeting at the family center. That's when they very first started the family center.
She was 2 years older than me, 2.5 years older. Well, no, we were real close. You realize you don't really have best friends when you lose your sister, because you realize that was your best friend, but we were just real close.
It's so hard to put in words because words sound so shallow. She was one of these people that was just real bubbly and giggly, and everything was fun to Christy. And she has a little boy named Shane, and of course he was her life.
They were telling families to bring pictures of the missing person to help identify bodies or people that they may have found that were not able to speak. Me and one of my friends got a bunch of pictures of her and went up there, and there was just people everywhere up there with pictures, and I ended up being there just about every night after that, just a meeting place with all the families, and that's the best information center you could be at to find out what was going on.
A little before 9:30 on that Thursday morning after the bombing, I arrived at the family center, and I began talking to the families, and I says, "Good morning, my name's Ray Blakeney, and I'm from the medical examiner's office." And since